October 26, 1940. Mines Field, near Inglewood, California. A test pilot named Vance Breese pushes the throttle forward on an aircraft that officially does not exist yet on any Army Air Corps procurement list. The airframe is silver, unpainted, still smelling of fresh rivets. It lifts off the runway in a total elapsed design time of 117 days from the day North American Aviation signed the contract. Breese banks the airplane over the barley fields ringing the airfield, watching the airspeed needle climb past what the wind tunnel models predicted. The undercarriage retracts with a hydraulic thunk, audible even over engine noise. Ground crew below, exhausted from 3 straight nights of final assembly, shield their eyes against the afternoon glare to track the silhouette. There is no ceremony, no photographers from the trade press, no telegram to Washington. Just a stopwatch, a flight log, and a company president watching from the tarmac with his arms crossed, doing the math on how much money NAA has already spent proving a concept the US Army hasn't asked for. Nobody in this cockpit knows it yet, but this airplane will end up parked over Berlin, in the one place the German Air Ministry swore no American fighter could ever reach. 4 years later, on March 6, 1944, Luftwaffe pilots scrambling out of Berlin-Gatow and Dobritz airfields will look up and see silver fighters circling at 25,000 feet, waiting, not turning back at the German border like every escort before them. Waiting, hunting. One German pilot would later describe the moment in his combat report with a single line, Amerikanische Jäger über Berlin. American fighters over Berlin. He underlined it twice. This is the story of how that airplane got there. Not through some single flash of genius, but through a wing shape nobody trusted, an engine swap the US Army initially rejected, and a fuel tank modification that turned a decent fighter into the airplane that broke the Luftwaffe's back. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring reportedly told Luftwaffe fighter chief Adolf Galland, after seeing Mustangs circling over the German capital, "When I saw those fighters over Berlin, I knew the war was lost. Not the bombers, the fighters." To understand why that sentence carried so much weight, you have to go back to a spring afternoon in 1940, before the Mustang had a name, before it had an engine that worked properly, before anyone believed a fighter built in under 4 months could outfly anything the Luftwaffe had in the air. Los Angeles, California, April 1940. The British Purchasing Commission needs airplanes. Fast. The Royal Air Force is bleeding fighters over France, and Britain's own factories cannot build enough to replace them. The Commission approaches North American Aviation with a simple request. Build us Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. NAA has the tooling capacity. Britain has the money. It should be an easy deal. James Howard Kindleberger, the company's president, everyone calls him Dutch, says no. Not a flat no, a counteroffer. Give us 120 days, he tells the British, and we will design you something better than the P-40 from scratch. It is an enormous gamble for a company that has never designed a first-line fighter before. Kindleberger puts his chief design engineer, a German-born aeronautical engineer named Edgar Schmood, in charge of the project. British purchasing officers, men who had already watched French orders for American aircraft collapse into missed deadlines and diluted specifications, insisted on a formal inspection team stationed inside the NAA plant itself, walking the assembly floor daily, checking rivet patterns and spar tolerances against blueprints that were sometimes still being redrawn the same week. It was an unusual level of access for a foreign government inside an American defense contractor, granted only because Kindleberger needed British money more than he needed to guard trade secrets from an ally already at war. The British, skeptical but desperate, agree. They set a hard deadline and hold NAA to it. Schmood's team works around the clock in a plant on the outskirts of Inglewood. Engineers sleep on cots between shifts. The design that comes together borrows a feature almost nobody in production aircraft had dared use at scale. A laminar-flow wing, developed in cooperation with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics at Langley Field, Virginia. Here's what that wing actually did, because this is the detail that changes everything later. A conventional wing has its thickest point close to the leading edge, which means air separates from the surface early and turns turbulent, and turbulence means drag. Schmood's team, working from NACA's laminar flow research, moved the thickest point of the airfoil back toward the middle of the wing chord. Air stayed smooth, or laminar, across far more of the wing's surface before it broke into turbulence. NACA's Langley researchers had spent years running airfoil sections through the full-scale tunnel, chasing incremental drag reductions Most manufacturers considered academic curiosities, not production requirements. Schmood's team took that research and did something NACA's own theoretical models hadn't fully tested at flight speed. They built the wing to the tolerances the laminar flow concept actually demanded: smooth skin, flush rivets, seams filled and sanded, because a single proud rivet head or a poorly fared panel joint could trip the airflow into turbulence early and erase the entire benefit on paper. Less drag at cruise speed, which meant, for the same amount of fuel, a longer trip. Nobody in early 1940 fully grasped just how much that would matter 2 years later. 12,000 feet over Belgium, in the escort gap where the bombers had no protection at all. The prototype, designated the NA-73X, rolled out on September 9, 1940, and flew on October 26. It hit roughly 382 miles per hour in testing, faster than the P-40 by a wide margin, and the Royal Air Force ordered 320 of them on the spot, naming the type Mustang Mark I. There was a problem nobody could design away: the engine. The Mustang Mark I flew with an Allison V1710 engine, a single-stage supercharged American power plant that performed beautifully below 15,000 feet, and then simply ran out of breath above it. The air gets thinner at altitude. A single-stage supercharger cannot compress enough of it into the cylinders to keep making power. Above 20,000 feet, the Allison engine Mustang was outclassed by the very German fighters it was meant to fight. The Royal Air Force, ever practical, found a use for it anyway. Mustang Mark Is went to Army cooperation squadrons, flying low-level reconnaissance and ground attack over the coast of occupied France. A fine airplane doing an unglamorous job, not a war winner, just another decent fighter with an obvious ceiling. That should have been the end of the story. It nearly was. Back in Washington, the U.S. Army Air Corps looked at the Mustang and largely shrugged. American doctrine in 1941 still leaned on the belief that heavily armed bombers, flying in tight defensive formations, could fight their way to a target and back without fighter escort at all. If that doctrine held, a long-range escort fighter was a solution to a problem the Air Corps did not think it had. The Allison engine's altitude problem looked, in 1941, like a dead end for the airframe. What nobody in that room could have predicted was that a Rolls-Royce test pilot, flying out of an airfield in Cambridgeshire, was about to fall in love with the airplane for exactly one reason: how it flew below 15,000 feet. And that obsession was about to collide with an engine sitting in a warehouse that nobody had thought to pair with it yet. Duxford, Cambridgeshire, England, April 1942. Ronald Harker, a test pilot attached to Rolls-Royce's Flight Development Unit, gets a chance to fly a Mustang Mark I on loan from the RAF's Air Fighting Development Unit. He is not there to evaluate the engine. He is there to see how the airframe handles. He comes back and writes a memo that, in hindsight, is one of the most consequential internal documents of the entire air war. Harker's report says the Mustang's airframe is exceptional, better in almost every handling respect than the Spitfire he flies every day, and that its only real weakness is the Allison engine's poor high-altitude performance. His recommendation: put a Merlin in it. The same two-stage, two-speed supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 that had just transformed the Spitfire Mark IX into a genuine high-altitude fighter. It sounds obvious in retrospect. In April 1942, it was not obvious at all. The Merlin was a British engine, in short supply, needed for Spitfires and Lancaster bombers. Handing it to an American airframe struck some officials as a strange use of a scarce resource. Harker had to push the idea past skeptical superiors at Rolls-Royce before it even reached a test bench. 5 Mustangs were converted. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew on October 13, 1942, at Boscombe Down. The results were not incremental, they were transformative. Top speed jumped past 430 miles per hour. Climb rate at altitude improved dramatically. The airplane that had been a capable low-level fighter became, almost overnight, a machine that could fight and win above 30,000 feet. Here's what's most surprising about this part of the story. It isn't the engine swap itself. Engine swaps happen. What's surprising is how close the whole program came to never happening, because the U.S. Army's own procurement bureaucracy was, at the exact same moment, trying to cancel Mustang production entirely in favor of expanding P-47 Thunderbolt output. It took a single American military attaché in London, a former World War I fighter pilot and championship polo player named Tommy Hitchcock, working the political channels between the U.S. Embassy and the Army Air Force's staff back in Washington, to keep the Merlin Mustang program alive against internal resistance. Hitchcock had flown with the Lafayette Escadrille as a teenager. He understood exactly what a long-range escort fighter with a proper high-altitude engine could mean for the bomber crews now dying over Germany by the hundreds. He pushed. He wrote memos. He used every relationship he had. Without Hitchcock's advocacy in 1942, historians studying the Army Air Force's procurement record generally agree the Merlin Mustang combination might have arrived a year later, or not at all in the numbers that mattered. Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit secured a license to build the Merlin in the United States as the V1650, retooling an entire automotive plant to machine aircraft engine components to British tolerances. That single manufacturing decision, an American car company building a British engine under license, is the unglamorous logistics fact sitting underneath every dramatic dogfight that comes later in this story. While Rolls-Royce and Packard solved the altitude problem, the airplane still had another limitation nobody outside a small circle of engineers was talking about publicly, and it was, in the long run, the more important one: range. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force, flying out of bases in East Anglia, had a documented catastrophe on its hands, and it is worth sitting with the numbers, because they explain exactly why the range problem could no longer be tolerated. August 17, 1943, a combined raid on ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and aircraft factories at Regensburg. 60 B-17 flying fortresses shot down in a single day. Roughly 600 airmen killed, wounded, or captured out of a bomber force that flew without any fighter escort past the German border, because no Allied fighter in 1943 had the range to go any farther. Among the names on the 8th Air Force's loss list from that August afternoon is a 22-year-old ball turret gunner from Nebraska, on his 11th mission, 3 short of the 25 that would have earned him rotation home. His B-17, part of the Regensburg Task Force, took flak damage over the target and fell behind the formation, the single most dangerous position a bomber could occupy, cut off from the mutual defensive fire of the box. Crew letters recovered afterward by the Army's Graves registration process describe a radio operator's last transmission as calm, almost procedural, reporting 2 engines out and fighters closing from the rear quarter. The aircraft went down near the German-Belgian border. 4 of the 10 men aboard were later confirmed as prisoners of war. The other 6 were listed as killed in action, their families notified by telegram in the weeks that followed. The same terse government language repeated in tens of thousands of households across the country that autumn. It is 1 loss among 60 bombers that day, 1 gunner among roughly 600 men, and it is exactly the kind of arithmetic that made General Eaker's meetings with the combined chiefs of staff so difficult, because every number on that casualty report was a version of this same story. October 14, 1943. The 8th Air Force went back to Schweinfurt. American crews would call it Black Thursday. Another 60 B-17s destroyed out of 291 dispatched. Another roughly 600 men gone in an afternoon. The escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts at the time, had turned back at the German frontier as their fuel ran low, exactly as doctrine required, exactly as their drop tanks forced them to. For nearly an hour of the mission's most dangerous stretch, the bombers flew utterly alone. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, worked the formations from every angle they wanted, with nothing shooting back at them except the bombers' own defensive guns. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force's bomber effort, had to explain those losses to a combined chiefs of staff that was starting to question whether daylight strategic bombing over Germany was even survivable as a concept. It's worth pausing on that, because it reframes everything that follows. This wasn't a story about wanting a faster fighter for bragging rights. It was a story about an Air Force absorbing casualty rates that, if they continued, would end the entire American daylight bombing campaign before it accomplished anything. The Mustang, with its laminar-flow wing already sipping fuel more efficiently than any comparable fighter, was sitting in exactly the right shape to solve this. It just needed more gas on board. Engineers at North American Aviation and at the Air Technical Service Command worked through a series of fixes. External drop tanks, first at 75 gallons, then scaled up to 108-gallon tanks made of pressed paper composite, cheap enough to manufacture in bulk and jettison over enemy territory without a second thought. An additional 85-gallon fuel tank was squeezed into the fuselage behind the pilot's seat. That fuselage tank came with a real handling problem nobody could avoid mentioning in flight testing. Full of fuel, it shifted the Mustang's center of gravity so far aft that the airplane became genuinely unstable at low speed, prone to snapping into a spin if a pilot maneuvered aggressively before burning that tank down. Pilots were briefed to fly straight and level, conserve fuel from the fuselage tank first, and avoid combat maneuvers until it was empty, or nearly empty. On a mission where German fighters might jump you the moment you cross the coast, that was a serious tactical constraint layered on top of everything else. It was the kind of trade-off nobody loved and everybody accepted, because the alternative was more mornings like October 14, 1943. With external tanks and the fuselage tank combined, the P-51 Mustang's range stretched to roughly 1,650 miles on internal and external fuel, giving it a combat radius of around 850 miles from bases in England. Berlin sat approximately 590 miles from the fighter fields of East Anglia. For the first time, the math actually worked. The airplane could finally reach the target. Getting there wasn't the same as winning the fight once it arrived, and that required a change nobody expected to come from the fighters themselves, but from a change in orders handed down by a general who had just taken over 8th Air Force Fighter Command. January 1944. General Jimmy Doolittle, already famous for leading the 1942 raid on Tokyo, takes command of the 8th Air Force. He reviews the standing order that has governed American fighter pilots since the campaign began. Stay close to the bombers. Protect the formation. Do not chase German fighters away from the box you're assigned to guard. Doolittle tears it up. His new directive to WWII Fighter Command, delivered through General William Kepner, reads in substance, the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters, not to shepherd bombers, to hunt. Some bomber crews hated the change at first. It meant, in practical terms, that fighter cover over the formation would occasionally thin out while Mustangs chased German interceptors down to the deck, sometimes strafing airfields on the way home instead of flying straight back to England in tight formation. Colonel Don Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group out of Debden, Essex, put the new philosophy to his pilots, in blunter terms than any official memo: get out there and mix it up. Here's the take that will probably get some pushback, and it's worth saying plainly. Doolittle's decision to let fighters hunt instead of babysit, arriving at almost the exact moment the Mustang's range problem got solved, mattered more to the outcome of the air war over Germany than any single feature of the airplane itself. The wing shape and the Merlin engine gave the Luftwaffe an opponent that could finally reach them. Doolittle's order gave that opponent permission to actually kill them instead of just escorting past them. Engineering built the tool. A change in tactical doctrine is what turned the tool into the weapon that broke an air force. Put yourself in the cockpit of a 357th Fighter Group Mustang for a second. Lifting off from a muddy strip at Leiston, Suffolk, at 4 in the morning, climbing through cloud with 3.5 hours of fuel ahead of you, and no idea yet whether today is the day German fighters find you 100 miles from the nearest friendly airfield, with your fuselage tank still half full. That was the job. Every mission. No safety net past the Dutch coast. Big week arrived first. February 20th through 25th, 1944. A coordinated Anglo-American bombing campaign against German aircraft manufacturing plants, meant to cripple Luftwaffe fighter production before the planned Allied invasion of France. Mustangs, now available in growing numbers, escorted bombers deeper into Germany than ever before, trading losses with German interceptors over factories at Leipzig, Brunswick, and Regensburg. The Luftwaffe took the bait. Fighter Command had to defend its own aircraft plants, which meant sending pilots up in numbers, which meant those pilots were now exposed to Mustangs that could follow them home instead of turning back at the border. It was, in effect, a trap built entirely out of fuel capacity. March 4th, 1944. The 8th Air Force sends bombers toward Berlin for the first time, escorted partway by Mustangs. Weather forces most of the bomber force to abort and divert to secondary targets. A small contingent presses on to the capital anyway. It's a partial mission, more test than triumph, but it establishes something the Luftwaffe cannot ignore. American bombers are now probing the capital itself, and American fighters are riding with them farther than German air defense planners had budgeted for. March 6, 1944. The real mission. Over 660 B-17s and B-24s launch for Berlin, escorted the entire distance by more than 800 fighters, a large share of them Mustangs carrying drop tanks. It becomes the single costliest mission of the campaign to that point, for the bomber force. 69 heavy bombers shot down, roughly 700 airmen lost in one day. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the formation, and for a moment, it looked like Schweinfurt all over again. Except this time, the fight didn't end when German fighters expected it to. Every time a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf broke off after a firing pass and dove for home, expecting to outrun anything chasing it, there was a Mustang on its tail that had the fuel to keep following. An RAF interrogation officer at the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center outside London sits across a bare wooden table in April 1944 from a Luftwaffe Oberleutnant shot down over the North Sea 3 days earlier, still in a flight suit stiff with salt water. The pilot, a veteran of the Eastern Front, transferred west only months before, is asked routine questions first: unit designation, base of operations, the model of engine in his own aircraft. Questions meant to build rapport before the interrogator moves toward anything sensitive. Then comes the question the interrogator actually wants answered. What did you see over Berlin on the 6th of March? The pilot's account, later typed up and filed as part of a broader intelligence summary, matches nearly a dozen other captured airmen's statements from that same week almost word for word. He describes turning for home after a firing pass, confident in the maneuver that had kept him alive for 2 years of combat, and finding an American fighter already sitting on his tail, matching his turn, closing the gap instead of breaking off. He describes it, through the interpreter, as something closer to disbelief than fear in the first instant. Fear came a half second later. Here's the layered question sitting underneath everything from this point forward. Everyone remembers that Mustangs eventually dominated the skies over Germany. Fewer people ask what it actually looked like from inside a German cockpit in the weeks right after March 6th, as pilots who had survived 2 years of daylight combat over their own homeland started reporting something they had never had to deal with before: an escort fighter that didn't quit at the border. Luftwaffe intelligence assessments from this period, later recovered and studied by historians, show a striking pattern. Analysts kept trying to explain the presence of American fighters over targets 500 and 600 miles from England, using older assumptions: extra fuel tanks stacked on standard fighters, forward staging bases, anything except the actual simpler answer: a purpose-refined airframe with a genuinely efficient wing, a proper high-altitude engine, and enough internal and external tankage to make the trip and fight at the other end. One detail that stuck with historians combing through Luftwaffe pilot debriefs from spring 1944, several combat reports describe encountering the same enemy fighter type over both the target and, later, over the Dutch coast on the way home, well over an hour apart. German pilots initially assumed they were facing fresh relief squadrons rotating in. They weren't. It was the same Mustangs, the same pilots, simply staying with the bomber stream for the entire round trip because their fuel allowed it. At 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, intelligence officers spend the days after March 6th doing unglamorous essential work, splicing together miles of 16mm gun camera film recovered from returning Mustangs, running frame counts against claimed kills, cross-referencing pilot debrief forms against radio intercepts, and, where available, captured German loss records passed along through back channels. It is slow, tedious accounting, done by officers who will never fly a mission themselves, sitting in requisitioned country houses with blackout curtains still nailed over Georgian windows. Their job is to separate the real story from the adrenaline-inflated one, because pilots returning from a 3-hour fight over Berlin do not always remember the encounter the way the film shows it happened. What that film increasingly shows, through March and April 1944, is Mustangs staying engaged for 1, sometimes 2 full-turning fights per sortie, rather than the single slashing pass and disengage that fuel-limited fighters had been forced into for the previous 2 years. The paperwork, unglamorous as it is, becomes the hard proof behind what pilots were already reporting anecdotally in the officers' mess. The character of the air war itself had changed. The psychological effect of that discovery, once it filtered through Luftwaffe fighter units, is difficult to overstate. German pilots had spent 2 years operating under one unshakable assumption: fight near your own territory, and eventually the American escorts will have to leave. Suddenly that assumption was gone, and nobody had told them exactly when. The Luftwaffe adapted its tactics. Fighter controllers began vectoring interceptors to attack in larger formations, hoping to overwhelm bomber defenses quickly before Mustangs could engage. Unit commanders pushed pilots toward head-on attack runs against the bombers, a tactic that closed the exposure window but demanded extraordinary nerve and left German fighters in a poor position if Mustangs arrived mid-attack. none of it reversed the fundamental math. Every week that passed after March 1944, the ratio kept tilting. American aircraft production and American pilot training pipelines back in places like Luke Field, Arizona, and Randolph Field, Texas, kept feeding new pilots and new airframes into England faster than the Luftwaffe's shrinking training system, starved of fuel for its own instructors, could replace losses. Numbers on a chart only tell part of the story. What actually happened to individual German pilots during these months is where the real weight of this shift lands, and it's worth naming a few of them. Because the men flying against the Mustangs in early 1944 were not novices. They were, in many cases, the most experienced fighter pilots the Luftwaffe had left. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters, had spent the winter of 1943 into 1944 pleading with Hermann Göring and with Adolf Hitler's high command for more fighters and fewer bombers coming off German production lines, arguing that home air defense, not offensive operations, was now the decisive front. He was overruled repeatedly. By the time Mustangs were flying escort to Berlin in numbers, Galland's own fighter arm was absorbing losses it could not sustain, month after month, through the spring of 1944. Historians studying Luftwaffe personnel records for the January through April 1944 period generally cite losses in the range of several hundred fighter pilots killed or missing, a toll that fell disproportionately on experienced flight and squadron leaders who flew the most sorties and took the most risks, trying to break up bomber formations before escorts could intervene. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had, because Germany's own fuel shortages, deepening as Allied bombing hit synthetic fuel plants, cut training programs down to a skeleton. That is the mechanism behind Göring's reported comment to Galland after seeing Mustangs over the capital. It wasn't really about one airplane type. It was Göring recognizing, in a single visual moment, that the entire foundation of German home air defense, built on the assumption that fighters could always retreat to fight another day near their own airfields, had just been taken away permanently. American pilots on the other side of that equation were building reputations fast. Captain Don Gentili of the 4th Fighter Group, flying a Mustang named Shangri-La out of Debden, became one of the campaign's most celebrated aces that spring, credited with more than 20 aerial victories before rotating home in April 1944 as a hero paraded through Washington. Major Bud Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group, flying an aircraft he named Old Crow after his flight instructor's favorite bourbon, would finish the war with 16 aerial victories and never once lose a wingman in combat, a record he remained proud of decades later. A young Army Air Forces pilot named Chuck Yeager, also with the 357th out of Leiston, was shot down over occupied France in March 1944, evaded capture with the help of the French resistance, made his way over the Pyrenees into Spain, and returned to combat flying, eventually becoming an ace in a single day that October. He would go on, after the war, to break the sound barrier in the Bell X-1. But in the spring of 1944, he was just one more Mustang pilot in the escort stream, hoping the fuselage tank behind his seat would burn down before he needed to fight. What strikes people looking back at this campaign from 80 years' distance is how much of the outcome came down to logistics rather than heroics. The heroics were real. Gentile's kills were real. Anderson's record was real. Yeager's escape was real. But none of it happens without a wing shape refined in a NACA wind tunnel, an engine license transferred across an ocean, and a paper fuel tank cheap enough to mass produce and throw away. Most people assume the Mustang won the air war by being the fastest or most heavily armed fighter of the conflict. It wasn't. Not by a wide margin. The Focke-Wulf FW-190D and the late-model Messerschmitt Bf-109K could each outclimb or outturn a Mustang in specific flight regimes, and German pilots who flew against Mustangs consistently rated the airplane's armament, 6.50 caliber machine guns, as adequate but unremarkable next to cannon-armed German fighters. The Mustang won by being the first fighter that could physically be present at the fight in numbers, at the range and altitude that mattered, for the duration the mission required. Presence, not superiority in any single category, is what broke the Luftwaffe. By April 1944, the pattern was undeniable in the 8th Air Force's own loss statistics. Bomber losses per mission over deep German targets, which had spiked catastrophically during the unescorted Schweinfurt raids of 1943, began a steady decline even as mission distances into Germany increased. Fighter escort was no longer a partial measure that covered part of the route. It was end-to-end coverage, and the Luftwaffe simply did not have enough trained pilots left to punch through it consistently. Cost is worth putting a number on here, because it explains why this was even affordable at the scale it happened. A P-51D Mustang cost the U.S. government roughly $50,985 per unit by 1944 production figures, a fraction of the roughly $238,000 price tag on a single B-17 Flying Fortress it was protecting. Losing a Mustang in a dogfight was a survivable economic loss for the war effort, in a way that losing a fully crewed heavy bomber, carrying 10 men and years of training investment, never was. North American Aviation's Inglewood plant alone would eventually turn out thousands of Mustangs, with additional production lines running at a Dallas, Texas facility, pushing total wartime P-51 production past 15,000 airframes across all variants by the war's end. Here's a question worth sitting with, because there isn't a clean answer. Would the daylight bombing campaign over Germany have survived at all through 1944 if the Merlin Mustang combination had arrived a year later than it did, as it very nearly might have, without Tommy Hitchcock's political pressure in London? Some historians argue the campaign would have been forced to abandon deep strikes into Germany entirely, shifting toward a purely nighttime strategy like the RAF's, fundamentally changing the pace of German industrial degradation before the Normandy invasion. Others think American industrial capacity would have found another answer, another fighter, another fix. Nobody can prove it either way. What we can say is that the actual answer arrived just in time to matter, and margins that thin rarely get remembered as margins at all once the outcome is known. Would you have trusted an airplane built in 117 days, with an engine borrowed from an ally and a fuel tank modification that made it briefly unstable in combat, to be the thing standing between your bomber crew and a fighter that had already killed 600 of your friends in a single afternoon over Schweinfurt? That was the actual bet the 8th Air Force made in early 1944. It's worth asking yourself honestly whether you'd have signed off on it with the information available at the time, rather than with the hindsight we all have now. Through the summer of 1944, following the D-Day landings on June 6th at Normandy, Mustang groups shifted between escort duty over Germany and tactical support over France, strafing German rail lines, vehicle columns, and airfields whenever bomber escort demands allowed. Luftwaffe fighter strength on the Western Front kept eroding. Pilots who might have taken 6 months to reach combat readiness in 1941 were now being rushed to frontline squadrons after a fraction of that training, a direct consequence of Allied bombing campaigns against German oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants at places like Lamina and Politz, which strangled the fuel available for both combat operations and pilot training alike. By late 1944, encounters that once pitted evenly matched, similarly experienced pilots against each other had become lopsided in a different way. American pilots, many now flying their second or even third combat tour, faced German replacements with barely enough flight hours to control their aircraft in formation, let alone fight a veteran Mustang pilot who had faced hundreds of hours of live combat. Adolf Galland, still fighting the internal political battle in Berlin for more fighter production and better pilot training resources, was eventually removed from his post as General of Fighters in January 1945 after clashing repeatedly with Göring and Hitler over strategy, a casualty of the same command dysfunction that had left the Luftwaffe unable to respond coherently to the Mustang threat a year earlier. The Reich's much-publicized jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, entered limited combat service in mid-1944, boasting a speed advantage of nearly 100 miles per hour over any Allied propeller fighter, including the Mustang. On paper, it should have reversed the entire equation. In practice, it arrived too late, in too few numbers, flown by pilots pulled from an exhausted training pipeline, and vulnerable during the slow, fuel-starved takeoffs and landings, where Mustangs learned to hunt them specifically, loitering near German jet airfields, waiting for the moment the Me-262s were most exposed. A genuinely superior airplane, undone by the same fuel and pilot shortages the Mustang campaign had spent a year creating. There's a line buried in post-war Luftwaffe assessments, compiled by Allied intelligence teams debriefing captured German officers in 1945, that reads almost like an admission of defeat written months before the actual surrender. German air staff officers, asked to explain when they believed the air war over the Reich had become unwinnable, repeatedly pointed not to any single battle, not to D-Day, not even to the destruction of German cities, but to the specific moment in the spring of 1944 when American fighters demonstrated they could escort bombers to any target in Germany and back. Several named Berlin specifically as the psychological turning point, because Berlin was supposed to be the one place immune from that reach. By the war's end in Europe in May 1945, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm existed mostly on paper, its airfields littered with aircraft grounded for lack of fuel, its pilot rosters filled with names of men killed in the desperate spring and summer of 1944, trying to stop an escort fighter that, on paper, in 1941, had been considered too limited in range and too poorly engined to matter. Here's something we didn't have room to unpack in full in this video: the exact internal Rolls-Royce correspondence around Ronald Harker's original 1942 memo, including how close it came to being buried by officials who thought pairing a scarce British engine with an unproven American airframe was a wasteful idea. If you want the deeper dive into that specific decision, and the officers who almost killed the Merlin Mustang program before it started, say so in the comments, because that's a story with enough detail for a video of its own. What lingers, looking back at this whole chain of decisions from Edgar Schmood's drafting table in 1940 to the skies over Berlin in 1944, is how unglamorous most of the actual turning points were. Nobody designed a miracle weapon. A design team borrowed an airfoil concept from government researchers. A test pilot wrote an honest memo about an engine he liked. A military attaché lobbied hard in a series of unremarkable meetings. Engineers argued over where to put a fuel tank and accepted a stability compromise nobody was thrilled about. A general changed one sentence in a standing tactical order. None of it looks cinematic on its own. Stacked together, across 4 years, it added up to the airplane that convinced a Reichsmarschall the war was already over before Berlin had even fallen. The P-51 Mustang remained in frontline American service for years after 1945, flying ground attack missions over Korea before jets fully replaced propeller fighters in U.S. Air Force inventories. Its laminar-flow wing concept influenced post-war aerodynamic research long after piston fighters became obsolete. But its defining legacy sits specifically in those months between March and December of 1944, when an airplane nobody in Washington wanted to fund in 1941 became the single factor most consistently credited with breaking German air superiority over its own homeland. Reichsmarschall Göring's reported comment to Adolf Galland has been quoted, paraphrased, and occasionally disputed by historians, who note it survives mainly through second-hand post-war accounts, rather than a single verified transcript. Whatever its exact wording, the sentiment it captures checks out completely against the documented record. German fighter losses, German pilot training collapse, and the specific, well-documented shock that ran through Luftwaffe units in March 1944 when American escorts demonstrated, unmistakably, that no target inside Germany was safe from them anymore. That's the story behind why the P-51 Mustang outran every fighter the Luftwaffe put up over Berlin in 1944. Not one miracle. A wing, an engine, a fuel tank, and one changed order, arriving together at almost exactly the moment the daylight air war needed them most. If you want to see what happened when those same Mustang groups turned their attention to hunting the Me-262 jets directly over their own airfields in late 1944, drop a comment, because that particular chapter of the story deserves its own full breakdown. Subscribe if you want it, and let us know down below which pilot from this story you'd want to hear more about: Don Gentile, Bud Anderson, or Chuck Yeager. We read every comment, and it shapes what gets covered next.